Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's been a very exciting conference so far. With that, I also want to thank my colleague Aletta for giving such a great talk on Monday, and I think she did try to do a little seeds for my talk today, so I hope I live up to that. To begin with, I'd like to talk about our organization. We are a leader in life science and biotech, and we're committed to accelerating this cultured meat industry. And we're doing that through our expertise in cultured media and bioprocessing technologies. So we want to establish ourselves as a trusted technology enabling partner for the cell cultured meat industry. With that, having a little bit of, choose to advance slides, there we are. I'll be giving a regulatory review on the food safety culture in cultured meat manufacturing. So again, I'm Luke Grocholl. I'm our head of food regulatory experts with Merck KGaA, Darmstadt, Germany. To tell you a little bit about our organization, we are part of the oldest pharmaceutical company in the world, over 350 years old. But really, we became global now with more than 57,000 employees, 66 countries, and working in a variety of fields. Also, just to clarify a little bit of the branding and language, Merck KGaA Darmstadt, Germany holds the right to the trade name Merck internationally, except for US and Canada. So you may know us in North America as EMD Serono, Millipore Sigma, or EMD Performance Materials. But with that, let's go ahead into the talk. And when we think about the regulatory environment for cultured meat, there's so much to cover. It's difficult to touch it all. So I like to give an introduction, talk about who regulates the meat industry, and then sort of do a travel log of the cultured meat process and how that's regulated or expected to be regulated. Then just talk about, well, what does it mean to be food grade? What does that manufacturing? And I hope we have time to talk about GMO because I think this topic will continually come up. So first of all, clean meat, who regulates that? And I do want to give the disclaimer, this is my understanding of the food regulatory environment and should not be construed as a directive or guidance from any regulatory agencies or individuals. But I think, as most of us know, we have two regulatory agencies that manage food in the US. We have the FDA and the USDA. And the lines between them, it's not a clear line, it's a little bit jagged. So usually easiest to talk about the USDA. They oversee meat, including poultry, catfish, and they also oversee eggs, but only egg products, not eggs in the shell. And I said they oversee meat and poultry and catfish, but not other seafood. And then there's products that contain both meat and other products. So the USDA has products with more than 3% raw meat or 2% or more cooked meat. And if we get into the subject of a sandwich, this is actually a kind of challenge with these two organizations. If you have a sandwich with 2 pieces of bread, that's FDA, but if you remove 1 piece of bread and it's open faced, then it might have enough meat to be USDA. So fortunately, they got together and discussed how they can tackle something like clean meat. And they came to an agreement. That is, the FDA would oversee cell collection, cell banks, cell proliferation and differentiation. But once the cells are harvested, once they become the meat, then it will be the USDA and they will manage it much in the way that they would manage the traditional meat industry. So that processing of the cells into meat, and certainly once we get to the labeling of that product, this is USDA territory. So with understanding the regulatory agencies, then we should understand the processes and see where each of them are really going to be involved. So if we have just kind of this little cartoon here of the clean meat process, once we extract the cells, we're going to have to develop and maintain cell banks, and then we're going to have to proliferate and differentiate those cells. And I love the watering can here as we feed the cells, and probably will go in through a bioreactor and eventually come out as that clean meat product. And somewhere in this step here, from that bioreactor to the clean meat, that's where that transition is going to take place. So everything prior to that is going to be managed by the FDA. And they'll also be responsible for coordinating that transfer to the USDA. And then the USDA will take over and will primarily look at the labeling and handling of that meat product. But if we talk about that FDA piece, then we have to start to be concerned, really, a lot of this process will take place in an FDA environment, at least in the US. And we have to ensure that the cultured meat facilities and the equipment and the ingredient meets all the requirements of FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But this is talking about things like our food GMPs and food defense and supply chain controls and preventive controls. And if some of these terms and languages are unfamiliar with you, these are things that you should start to get familiar with, because this is the terms and languages the FDA uses when they think about food. So I'm going to start with the bioreactor and sort of work backwards from there, because the bioreactor itself has a lot of challenges. Because if we consider a bioreactor in terms of like biopharma, then, really we look at a lot of what I have numbered here, 2 through 6, the biocompatibility aspects, looking at particulates, looking at extractables, things like sterility. All these are in terms of what we think about like a biopharma, and that relies a lot on guidances that we find in the USP and ISO. And even things like integrity testing, which is still being developed for like things like the disposable bioreactors. This comes from industry best practice. But within the scope of all that, we also have to consider the FDA and food contact materials. So you need indirect food additives, and they have to be tested in accordance with 21 CFR 117. And for the non-regulatory people, don't worry, I'm not going to throw up a bunch more numbers on here. I just want to emphasize that even where we have a clear understanding that the FDA will regulate probably that bioreactor aspect, we're still going to have to rely on some guidances that are going to come out of the biopharma industry, who are very familiar with the type of bioreactors that are likely going to be used in this space. But if we continue to move back, then we have to talk about cell banking and what are some of the requirements around there. And again, this is a very gray area, because we really don't think about cells to be eaten. So it's likely that we'll look at some of the same regulations that we see for biologics or vaccine production will be that model that the FDA will use. So again, it's likely going to be based on some of these things like the ICH Q5 series or the FDA or EMA guidelines around the cell banking themselves. And then we have potential requirements for any vectors used for generating engineered cells, as well as traceability all the way back to the health of the animal, which will include things like the country of origin of that animal and aseptic collection. So again, here we're standing in more of a biopharma space. But when we get to the media, here's an interesting piece. Because the FDA announced that substances used in the productions of cultured tissues would likely have to be GRAS, generally recognized as safe. This is what the FDA describes as substances generally recognized among qualified experts as having been adequately shown to be safe under its conditions of use in food. So now we're moving much more to a food space. And it's going to involve, if we look at something like media, doing a GRAS submission for that, which is a pretty daunting piece. That it's going to be based on the safety evaluation by an independent committee. It may involve some lengthy and expensive testing like genotoxicity or cytotoxicity. And for those not familiar with the GRAS process, I thought it might be worthwhile to talk a little bit about the history of that, how it was developed, and how the FDA really sees this. So when we think about regulating foods, this goes back to the turn of the last century with the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act. Eventually becoming the modern Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1938. And it really was looking at acute health issues associated with poisons in food and the managing of food, but didn't really tackle the idea of modern food additives, the chemicals that are being used in food for preservation or for flavor or for other requirements. So in 1958, we have the Food Additive Amendment comes into effect. And this lays the groundwork that one needs to do a dedicated tox study for anything added to food. So the food industry, well, they pushed back on this and they said, look, we've had additives we've been adding to food for decades, sometimes a century or more. And if you want a good experiment to show that this stuff is safe, just look at the public consumption. So they really published that there are just some food additives out there that the whole food industry, the whole scientific community recognizes as safe for food. And that's how we get that term generally recognized as safe. And initially there was an agreement between the FDA and the food industry on which ingredients had that long history of safety. And that's where we get an initial list of about 700 or so substances. But again, there were new substances being developed, added. Some of these were simply materials that were isolated from existing foods. We see a lot of this in the flavor industry, for example, and it led to then a reevaluation of GRAS substances, and that some of them, we could take a similar approach that we wouldn't have to do a full tox study on these materials, but rather have an evaluation by a scientific committee, particularly an independent committee, to approve them. And this led to the modern GRAS process, first through FDA petition process, and later through some refinements through then that some materials can be self-GRAS through an industry could do that evaluation, work with a independent committee, and then demonstrate those materials are safe. I do also want to point out, of course, this is not a static or continually growing list, that sometimes materials can be removed from GRAS status, including at times we do see materials removed, maybe not for the most logical reasons. Recently, we had 7 synthetic flavors removed based on an old clause that I won't have time to go into, but sometimes there are things like industry groups that do push to have some ingredients removed, not necessarily based on a scientific basis. But all that being said, when we look at something like the cell culture media, this is a complex mixture. It has buffers, bases, salts, amino acids, proteins, lipids, and all these materials in there, and you could have 30 or 40 or more. They may be listed currently as a GRAS or FDA approved material, but likely many of them will not be. So if one were to take the approach of looking at each of these and doing a full tox study to get them a approved as a food additive, that's really is a daunting task. So, what I think we should consider as an approach where we really look at, are the materials, first of all, recognized as GRAS? And if they're not, take a risk approach. And a risk-based approach is quite common in food. So we could consider that there are some materials of very low risk. Maybe there's a lot of precedent for use of them in other human applications. In this case, one could build up a GRAS case based on literature precedent. There might be some that really there's not a lot of evidence out there for safety in human consumption, but with a toxicological analysis, data could be collected, scientific data, to demonstrate that they're safe. And these ones I really consider moderate risk. But when we look at something like a cell culture media, there might simply be components in there that the FDA is just going to consider high risk for a human application, and we will need to find alternative materials. I kind of focus on the media here, since those are generally known mixtures of components, but certainly anything added to food should take this approach. So you should take a similar approach to things like a scaffold or other components that do end up in the food. Now, I've talked a little bit about this tox analysis, but in the end, you're going to have to take the resource considerations, and really when we talk about assembling a GRAS study, it's expensive and it takes quite a lot of time, and that might have to be done for every single component in that cell culture media that is not recognized as GRAS. And when we start talking about toxicological studies, that's where we start to run into costs that range in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, it may be that some of these components, there is considerable human use data in the literature, even if it's not for food use, and that can be used as the basis for a GRAS dossier. But ultimately, I fully expect that to qualify ingredients that go into manufacturing the cultured meat, primarily looking at that cell culture media, that one would have to go through this GRAS status. And one of the challenges or perhaps concerns with going through a GRAS process is that's generally that's publicly available information. So that, one could run into IP concerns with that. There are some routes to protect IP. That would be doing a full food additive petition, where that information is really a conversation between the firm and the FDA alone, but that can considerably drive up costs as well as time for approval. And depending on the depth of tox study that is required to demonstrate to the FDA that the material is safe, you can not only run into the high hundreds of thousands, but even $1 million plus for a truly new food ingredient that you have to do a full tox study on. So there are going to be challenges in just bringing a food grade media or food grade scaffold to market. Fortunately, though, said if a full tox study is not needed, if there is sufficient evidence to put together a safety dossier. In the US, fortunately, there are resources for that. In the FDA, they have this database called Substances Added to Food, but for people like me who've been involved with food regulations for a while, I still think of this as the EAFUS database, the Everything Added to Food in the US. But if you just Google Substances Added to Food or EAFUS, you can get to this database and start to look at those components and see if they are listed in the FDA as a food approved material. And there's also several databases in the regulations if you want to go into that, but those are also referenced in this FDA database. I do have the URL here. I should also notice that the FDA in their landing page do also reference other sites for GRAS approval. FEMA GRAS is one, which is from the flavor industry. That's the Flavor Extract Manufacturing Association, not the Federal Emergency Management Act. JECFA is a joint WHO-UN group that looks at the safety of food additives. FCC, which is the Food Chemical Codex. For those of you familiar with USP, it's the same organization. The National Academy also has well, it's not a pharmacopoeia, it's a codex because it's for food. But these all also references substances that are approved for use as food. But I should stipulate all of these are food at intended use. So if one is going to use, say, a FEMA GRAS approved material in a cell culture media, you'd still have to do work to show that even though it's approved, its intended use is in flavoring, it would still have to be demonstrated that it would also be appropriate for something like a animal cell growth, a cell proliferation. Now, so far, I've really just been talking about the US. In the EU, they maintain a strict approved list of food additives. The regulation there is 1333/2008, and they use the term E-numbers. Interestingly, they also do have a flavor regulation, 1334, but they are very clear in the EU. If that's in the flavor regulation, it's not a food additive and can't be used as a food additive, or vice versa, even if, say, the amount used in the food is the same. And there's nothing like this GRAS process. You really do have to assemble a firmer dossier and have that approved by the European Food Safety Authority to be used in food. And they also have a novel food regulation I'll talk about in a bit, but this even sets a greater challenge to overcome to get an approval for ingredients used in food. So that novel food, you know, I think a key is looking at this last year. Jens Karsten stated that cultured meat is novel food par excellence. This is almost their model of novel food. It's a generic authorization of cultured meat as a category is unlikely. It's more likely to be product by product. So what they're seeing is even that final end food will likely have to go through a novel food approval. And you know, I'll point you towards, again, regulation. I know I have a lot of regulation numbers in here, but that really manages novel food. I could give a complete hour seminar alone on novel food application. I probably won't cover the topic, but one thing to be cautious with in Europe is under EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, they really take a cautionary approach. So in that food or ingredients cannot be considered safe where scientific uncertainty persists. That's the cautionary principle. And that sets a higher bar than the risk management perspective that the US sets. And you know, there's some quirks in there too. For example, a novel food that is intended to replace another food should not differ from that food nutritionally. So if we think about that final product, say a cultured salmon, it has to be nutritionally equivalent or not significantly differ from salmon to really be accepted as a novel food. And again, EFSA usually considers worst case scenario, and that includes vulnerable groups. So in the US, when they look at worst case scenario, they're really going to look at what is the worst case in terms of maximum consumption by the average consumer. In the EU, they're going to look at what is going to be the most vulnerable consumer that's going to consume that food. So I've talked a little bit about, you know, kind of get that food approved, but ultimately then when you're making your cell cultured food, you're going to do so in a food grade environment. So what does it mean when we consider food grade? What is that manufacturing environment? First of all, I was on a talk earlier, I think it was New Harvest hosted, and there was another regulatory colleague who I thought said something very profound. It says, we have to stop talking about cell cultured food in terms that the biopharma industry uses or other industry, and start using food terms, start using the terms that we think about in foods, terms like food safety and hazard analysis and HACCP and risk mitigation, and get these language kind of into our quality blood. In fact, in my role, I've worked with some of our groups that have converted sites for manufacturing pharmaceutical ingredients to dual use those for food. And one of the first things I say, whenever you think in your current system quality, replace that with food safety and think about that in terms of food safety. But what are the elements of really food grade? And I said I'd talk a little bit more about the Food Safety Modernization Act, because this is the overarching law now that guides food safety in the US. Was initially signed into law in 2011, so it's not even a decade old, but is still continuing to have impacts on the regulatory environment about how food is managed in the US. And really the key that FSMA looked at is they wanted to change from responding to food safety incidents to preventing them. So they really have a risk-based preventive approach. And this language permeates the regulations that are driven by FSMA. So one of the things they said was to improve the capacity to prevent food safety problems. So they developed this process called HARPC, hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. For those familiar with HACCP, HACCP in the food world, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, you can think about this as the US equivalent, if you will, of HACCP. It's not exactly equivalent. HACCP actually will meet the HARPC requirements, but there are other ways to meet the HARPC requirements. It also involves protection against intentional adulteration food defense. That's the concern that someone could intentionally decide to poison your food, and you have to have systems set up, sites from site security and limiting the people who could be in a capacity to intentionally disrupt or poison the product, to looking at things as simple as sealing the end product up in tamper-resistant containers to manage your shipping of the material. Wants to improve the capacity to detect and respond to food safety problems. So one of those is traceability of all of your ingredients and raw materials, so that we can understand if there's a food safety problem and trace that back to the source. There's also been a big increase in emphasis within the regulations of allergens. So even if your process is completely allergen-free, you still have to have an allergen control plan, for example, to demonstrate that. You also have to think about things like, improving the safety of imported food is in FSMA. And from that, we get the foreign supplier verification program. And that might trickle down to simply, validating that your raw materials are from a manufacturer, if they're imported, that manufacturer meets FDA equivalent requirements, or you identify what potential risks are involved with that manufacturer, mitigate those when you receive them. So if we think about the food ingredients themselves, things like, the scaffolding or the cell culture media or the culture meat itself, you will need food GMP in place. And again, if you're coming out of the biopharma world, I think sometimes there's this idea that that GMP is somehow has a hierarchy in sort of pharma GMP is the highest, and if you meet that, you meet other GMPs like food or cosmetic GMP, and that's just simply not true. There are certainly overlapping elements to that, but really you need to look at the food GMP requirements and meet that food GMP. So that includes this HARPC plan, or a HACCP plan is more common in the food industry and certainly more common internationally than HARPC. One of the important things is you need a qualified individual. It explicitly states that in the regulations. So you will need a food safety expert to manage and set up your systems at your site that's qualified to the requirements that the FDA stipulates. You know, you'll often hear the term PCQI. That's a preventive control qualified individuals. But there's courses out there, there's training available that the FDA offers through partners as well as many third partners. And allergens, very, very important to the food industry because number one reason for food recalls is undeclared allergens. So FDA and other regulatory agencies very cognizant of allergens. Raw material qualification, I talked about, you know, foreign supplier verification programs, saying you have to look at where you're sourcing your raw materials, determine if they're meeting the equivalent of the FDA if you're manufacturing in the US, and if they're not, determine if there are mitigation steps you can set up upon receiving the material. You're going to have to qualify all those raw materials, even if the raw materials themselves are not food grade and will be processed, for example, into a food grade product. Once you receive them, you still have to consider what are the risks involved. Sanitary transportation is another important piece. How's that raw material getting to you? How are you shipping your product? I'll talk about GMO and bioengineering at the conclusion. I think that's something that has to be addressed. You know, and there's others. I'll see, even to a certain matter, just bureaucratic things that have to be managed. You have to register your site with the FDA as a manufacturing facility for food or even for holding ingredients. Food facility registration. I said you have to have a food defense program to show, you know, how you prevent somebody, either an employee or an outside individual, from intentionally poisoning the food. A food fraud program. You know, it probably lies outside the scope of the cultured meat industry, but, you know, this is addressing things like we had, you know, the horse meat scandal in Europe, where horse meat was sold as beef. And, you know, the seafood industry is just ripe with one type of fish being, or seafood being passed off as another. So you should have a program in place, you know, really verify that what you're selling is what you're labeling it. Again, with the traceability of the cell lines, it's probably going to be straightforward for the self-cultured industry, but you're still you know, the FDA is still going to be looking for a demonstration of that. And of course, whenever we talk about any sort of regulated program, you know, you're going to want to document and be able to demonstrate and label and have all that available for any type of audit or demonstrating that. And that's not only for the product itself, but maybe all raw materials. So again, if we talk about allergens, you might think, you know, I'm making cultured chicken. Chicken itself is not an allergen. I'm starting with chicken cells. I really don't have to be concerned about allergens, but you still have to consider every raw material coming into your plant, your lab could be a potential source of allergens. So you really want things like allergen statements for every one of those ingredients. Food defense, there is a food defense guidance on the FDA website. They do want certain elements. In fact, I think I discussed that a lot, but really to ensure that, again, that you assess where in your process there's a vulnerability, somebody intentionally poisoning the food, establish a mitigation strategy to reduce the risk to that, monitor that, see if they're in, you know, testing and challenging that system. If there's anything lacking, you find, establish corrective actions, verify that that process is looking, and, you know, it's just set it up as a quality system within your facility. So I want to talk about HACCP, I've talked about this HACCP. HACCP is hazard analysis and critical control points. And I like that we just had that talk about cultured food for space, because really HACCP was developed for the space agency. It was developed for NASA, where NASA gave a challenge is how, they could not have an astronaut getting sick. So they challenged the food industry to guarantee that food could not have a foodborne illness that would cause illness to one of their astronauts. And the food industry initially says, we can't. In order to do that, we would have to sequester, test, and destroy the food, and then you wouldn't have the food to consume. But I think it was actually Nestle who came up with the HACCP concept. And that really said, let's just break down our food manufacturing process and look at every step and consider the potential hazards involved with each step. So here's just a little cartoon of a process. So you might receive raw materials, and they might go into storage, and you might charge a reactor. You might have to, I don't know, nitrogen flush that reactor, and then you get products out. You might have to purify and filter, and then go into packaging. And what happens is look at each of these steps and consider the potential hazards at each step, and then put up control points to mitigate those hazards, reduce them to acceptable levels. Or you might determine that that hazard could be mitigated at a later step. So if you talk about, say, a traditional food manufacturing plant where you have to consider, potential pathogens in the meat, you might consider, irradiating that meat at some point, or in a dairy product, pasteurize that at some point. So you can say at some later step we'll do that. But what HACCP really looks at is in that last step, that last chance to control hazards, we're going to consider that a critical control point. And you have to have an absolute measure of something you verified is going to eliminate that hazard. It could be something like irradiation or pasteurization. If you have a cutting or grinding process, it might be magnets to make sure there's no broken pieces of equipment in there. It could be like we use in the food additive world, just pulling a sample out of every batch and analyzing that. But you should think about this for the cultured meat industry. So if we think about that, where we have just a step where we have cell lines and we have media and we have scaffold, and these might be going into a bioreactor together, or at some latter step where these get combined, we're still going to have at some point where we're delivering the cultured meat and some critical control point we have to control there and maintain to a standard. So, and we could set up critical control points with each of these lines. So, each, whether it's the media or the cell line, could have its own critical control point based on thinking about the potential food hazards that could be in place and setting up a test or process or method to mitigate those hazards. Your critical control points might be hazards introduced from the CCM or the bioreactor, where you could wash and remove those, for example. Food GMP. When you think about a GMP environment, you might already have a very clean aseptic environment involved in your cultured manufacturing. But you also have to realize, if we're going to bring the FDA in there from a food perspective, they're going to be applying food GMP. It might have elements you don't think of. Some of the things might be straightforward, like no food or drink, but it might come down to where and how you have located your hand washing stations, your cleaning and sanitation for all of your surfaces that could potentially come into contact, and making sure that your cleaning reagents are labeled and stored separately from, say, raw materials. Even if you have maybe an ERP to control this is still very important, because the FDA is concerned. How do we know somebody's not going to grab a cleaning reagent and put that into the food? You, of course, want pest control. You might have to even implement some things like It might be a wholly contained process, but even having things like everybody is going to be required to have hairnets, you're going to have to look at this from a risk process and likely even just contact your local FDA inspector or state food inspector and have these conversations about what does a GMP, a food GMP environment look like in context of what you're doing. And even your thoughts for mitigating this may not be a risk in our process. It's good to have those conversations with the regulators to verify and even to start to win them over to this is how we should think about these processes. So I did say I wanted to talk about GMO. I think it will be a touchy subject. So I called it this final section, we have to talk about GMO. And the reason why is simple. We have consumers and we have consumer groups, what I call the NGOs driving GMO, the ones who are considering what we want for GM safety. So I highlight a few key ones here. The Sierra Club is very active. They have taken a, I'll say, important non-stance on cultured meat. They just question the overall energy resource benefits because they are focusing, what is that environmental impact? So they're kind of asking, give me more data. We're not going to put the Sierra Club stamp on cultured meat, but we're willing to listen. Greenpeace hasn't really talked about cultured meat, but they have, they do support the overall reduction of meat consumption. So, they're very pro, for example, alternative protein. But we have other organizations like Friends of the Earth who have published I'll call it a pamphlet dating from lab to fork, where they flat out oppose cultured meat. And one of the key reasons they oppose this, is GMO. So let's talk about GMO. GMO guidance and regulations probably goes back a few years after the first transgenic papers were published with the Asilomar conference. And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But, almost from the get-go, there was talk about between scientists and legal experts and government authorities about how do we manage this technology and make sure it is safe. And initially, there was a lot of guidelines and agreements on how GMO was managed. However, we started to see in the 90s, we started to get GM regulations. Started in Europe really with the concern of what was called the deliberate release of GMOs into the environment. In other words, planting GM crops. The European concern was we want GM crops to be contained and we don't want, for example, GM corn to get over into the wild or into a non-GM corn crop. But by the late 90s, by 97, we got to requirements for labeling GM food. The modern regulation is the EU GMO Regulation 1830-2003. It goes to 2003 and basically says any food manufactured with a GM ingredient must be labeled as such. Now, this is regardless if there's any genetic material in that crop. If we look at that regulation, it says food and feed products produced from genetically modified organisms consisting of or containing GMOs must be labeled. So they say it has to now be labeled with that name, but really the key I think we have to understand with this is any food containing GM ingredients, even things like flavors or additives, must be considered GMO from the EU perspective and labeled as such. And that's even food made from GM feedstock. So if we start with something like GM corn and we isolate from that starch and we take that starch and isolate another chemical from that and we take that and do a chemical conversion and end up with a flavoring molecule that's delivered as a high purity material to the food industry, no genetic materials, several steps removed from the GM crop, that's still considered a GM ingredient, and it's going to result in a food in Europe that's labeled as containing GM ingredients. So it's important to understand in the EU that it covers food produced from a GMO, any of those scenarios, but actually it doesn't cover food produced with a GMO. So what does that mean? Well, that's things if it's used in the food production, but is removed from the food, so processing aids, or food derived from organisms fed GMO. So, you know, if you take cattle and feed them GM grain, the cattle are not considered GM. Food derived from organisms treated with GM medicines. So again, you take that cattle and you use GM medicines or nutritional supplements. Those are not considered food. In fact, you can take GM microorganisms and use those to produce food, like in the fermentations, like we see with cheese or beer. Those can be GM GM yeast. That still is not considered GM labeling required. But again, if anything in that supply chain is a derivative from that, if you can trace that back to a GM source, that's GM. And there's still some odd challenges to this. The definition of GM in the EU explicitly states that mutagenesis is not considered GM. There's a recent finding in 2008 that says, oh, but modern mutagenesis methods such as zinc finger nuclease or TALEN or CRISPR-Cas9 are GM, and any crops derived from them would require GM labeling. And then the European Food Safety Authority rejected this, but then France and the Netherlands adopted this. So it is still a complicated situation, particularly in Europe. So, do want to have some time for questions. I'm going to speed up just a little bit and jump back over to the US, where in 2014, Vermont passed a GM law that was almost immediately challenged because at that point it says that, you know, if we have this law for one small state, it could really impact interstate commerce, but it drove the need for a US regulation. And with that, we get 7 CFR 66, the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard, which basically said that food manufactured or containing, manufactured using bioengineering or containing ingredients produced using bioengineering must be labeled as such. It does provide some exemptions if the food does not contain genetic material, but does say you can only get that exemption if you have a validated refining process, validated to remove the genetic material, or if you have verified testing showing there's no genetic material in that food. And it also gives quite a bit of leeway on how that it's communicated that it does contain bioengineered food, because that could be simply, you know, you could have something text whatever number for more information on this food, or a barcode that you can scan for more information on the food, and that can lead to a website that says, you know, it's made with bioengineered ingredients. Japan has some food labeling requirements around GM, but it really focuses specifically on 8 crops and 33 ingredients from those crops, so probably outside the scope of cultured meat. So really just to sum up and give some time for questions, you know, the US said the FDA will oversee really the scaffold, the cell growth, the CCM, and once it's processed in the meat, the USDA will take over. Again, raw materials, direct contact, such as reactors and other ingredients, must be food grade at their intended use to be used in the US. And all ingredients must be under food GMB requirements. And finally, you know, for GMO, there's going to be regulations that will probably drive GMO labeling. Plus, we still have to keep an eye on those NGOs and what they look for the consumer labeling. With that, I do want to invite you to collaborate with our organizations. You can connect with us here, but let's turn it over to our moderator to see if we have times yet for some questions. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Luke. That was such a comprehensive presentation touching on so many very important topics for this sector. My name is Brian Sylvester. I'm special counsel at Covington and Burling in the Washington, D.C. office, and I work with our global food, drug, and device and regulatory team on a range of issues, including working with alternative protein stakeholders. So I'm going to get us kicked off with a Q&A with a few questions I had, and then I'm going to start taking questions from the audience, of which they are piling up. So starting with genetic engineered ingredients, to the extent a cell-based meat product is required to be declared as GE in the EU, but no such disclosure is required in the US for cell-based meat and poultry based on the way the standard is written in the United States, what would your advice be to a producer in this space when it comes to labeling and marketing? Do we take the approach that some have in the plant-based food space and simply develop marketing materials to explain the use of GM ingredients and why they're safe?
That's a very good question. And when we come to the GMO labeling or the bioengineered labeling in the US, it really is a lot around marking how you want to present your food. If you're comfortable with that element of having that label on there, that's certainly your choice. Except there is really a very negative view of GM in Europe, particularly in some regions like Germany and France. Some other countries are much more accepting, like Spain. But if we think of, if you will, the PR, how to promote that despite being bioengineered or GM, this is a good product. I think we can look to some of these NGOs that are driving that conversation, like Greenpeace and Sierra Club, say, culture meat, this really aligns really well with your core values of an environmentally friendly product. It's reducing pasture use, it's reducing harm to animals, it's reducing greenhouse emissions. That technology is giving you a solution, and change the conversation from GM or be safe to this is just a superior product because it's earth friendly.
Absolutely. And I mean, we know here in the US that there's a labeling working group at the FDA and USDA focused on issues generally for labeling, standards of identity, and perhaps the GE question will come up in those conversations as well. We also saw an RFI from FDA for seafood, cultured seafood labeling, and we saw a request from industry regarding a possible advanced notice of proposed rulemaking and asking for just information from the meat and poultry producers in this space. Do you think that this is an opportunity to talk about the GM question as part of those conversations?
Absolutely. And for those not familiar with it, this is open to the public. You can go to regulatory.gov. You can look up the topic for cell cultured meat, and that should be the one that pops up, and it's open towards public comment. But this is our opportunity to communicate directly to the regulatory authorities on how we feel the product should be labeled, and whether we feel even the genetic modification or bioengineered, as we're talking about it in the USDA space, is appropriate for this food. Now, the BE regulation, it is law now, which is that 7 CFR 66 that, food made using bioengineered methods must be labeled as such. And one should really look at their technology and see if it falls within that guidance. Again, when we look to the regulatory agencies, the best we can do is have as much open disclosure as we can. Talk about our thinking of why it may be exempt from the Bioengineered Disclosure Act, and discuss that with the regulatory authorities. One of the narratives going around opposing GE as unsafe is to say that it's been not reviewed enough by the FDA, that the regulatory agencies are not involved, there's not enough transparency. So to open up that conversation, to start, here's an excellent opportunity through regulatory.gov to begin those conversations with the regulatory authorities. Absolutely. And I'd encourage everybody in this cell cultured meat to take an opportunity for that. It's not always we get to put our opinion directly to the regulatory authorities.
Absolutely. I think we have a great opportunity to really help shape what the regulatory approach is here in the US for sure, and then just globally as different jurisdictions look into this sector. Going back to the part of your presentation, talking about GRAS and looking at the different inputs, human growth hormones are discussed at conferences and in the literature for use in producing cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood. And given the regulatory considerations you reviewed with us today, do you see a place for the safe use of such substances in the production process? And do you think we'll see differences in this regard across jurisdictions, just based on your experience so far in sifting through the regulations and conversations you've had, perhaps?
Well, I mean, the short answer is yes. I see a path towards approval for those. That's looking at the GRAS or food additive approval. There are different regulatory environments around the use of human-derived ingredients in food, and it's not out of that world. We certainly have like cysteine could be derived from duck feathers or from human hair, and we use cysteine in food, so it's not outside the scope, and there is already a regulatory environment around there. So again, if we look though at any of our growth factors used in our media, those should be approved for use in food. And when I talk about that they should be GRAS ingredients, I've had conversation with the FDA where they essentially said, we consider these ingredients being added to food and they should be GRAS. Now, it's potential that you could demonstrate that they are consumed to such an extent in the cell growth that they are not in the end food, in the end meat in any appreciable quantity, and therefore do not present any risk. But you still have to present the scientific evidence for that. So the material itself may not be GRAS, but there's sufficient scientific evidence to demonstrate that it does not create any hazards in the end food. So you still would take a GRAS-like approach to gaining approval, whether it's a growth factor or any other ingredient in the media.
Okay, great. Well, we have a couple of questions from the audience, from the attendees, and I'd like to start off with the following. So you briefly touched on the potential to repurpose stem cell manufacturing facilities for cultured meat. What modifications would be required to the building and quality control? What testing would be needed to be performed on site? Would a QP equivalent be required to release the cell product?
There's a lot in there. And I think the first that I really want to emphasize is one could certainly use biopharma GMP grade facilities. Most likely have have the majority of the elements one needs to have a food grade manufacturing facility. To get down to it, what are the strict requirements? First, you're going to have a PCQI, a preventive controlled qualified individual, to do exactly that. Look at your process and determine what is aligned with the food regulations. Likely, you're going to have already the controls in place. You're just going to have to document them and frame them in a place that speaks to food safety rather than to like biopharma safety. There will be a couple of other elements. I talked about food defense a lot because I think that's oftentimes something people forget is, they can demonstrate their whole process is clean, aseptic, that there's really not the possibility of introducing any hazards into their food. They've done a thorough food hazard analysis, and still an FDA inspector might say, well, how do you know Brian sitting there isn't going to put poison in your food? And you have to have a program to address that, because they're thinking from that food perspective, where you might have large open vats of materials. You have to think about those elements. So, it's a complicated question, but the best way to do it is to get the training of a PCQI, review the regulations, just go element by element of 21 CFR 117, look at each of those GMP requirements, and you can just check the box. Yep, we already cover this in our existing quality systems. It's documented there. Or nope, this is one we haven't documented. Let's look at it. Likely you can address that simply by a risk assessment, but it may simply be something that you have to add. So I gave the example of oftentimes there has to be a set number of sinks for hand washing in your facility. If for whatever with your structure, you just don't have that, you don't have the plumbing there, you don't want to tear apart your facility. If you can demonstrate your process is still safe to prevent dirty hands from contaminating your product because of the other systems you have in place and where your sinks are located, you can present that to a regulatory authority. But you just have to think, they're coming from a food world. So they're thinking about, people at a meat packing plant that are processing food, or people at McDonald's who are putting together your burger, and what are the quality systems around those.
Right. I think the good news here is that there is a lot of existing precedent on the books, and it's just about the regulators like basically creating guidance tailored to the sector. But there's a lot that we can look to in the meantime, while the working groups are, synthesizing information from the stakeholders, as well as like what they have in current guidance and laws.
And I will say there's a lot of precedent in thinking about this, taking a facility that's already more of a pharma grade or excipient grade and using it for food manufacturing. IFAC, the International Food Additive Council, has a nice GMP guide for food. I'd recommend going to that. I think there is a version that you can go to that and download for free. But they also have this nice guidance they put together to say, okay, let's put this food additive quality system, and they're thinking in terms of a chemical manufacturing plant for their perspective, looking at those elements, what you don't traditionally think of in a food processing plant.
Absolutely. So we're a little bit over time, but I think we might be able to squeeze in one more question from the attendees. And so I have it up. If you have an FDA approved small molecule drug being approved for medical purposes and want to use that in the cell culture media, do you need to get GRAS approval for use in food?
Yes. However, you can use a lot of that information for that drug to show that it's safe for food. But it's been very clear from the FDA, regardless of its human application and approval, if it is not GRAS, it needs to be GRAS and needs a GRAS approval. Similarly, in the EU, there you're going to have it as a food additive, even though it might be purely acceptable for other human use applications.
Right. There's certain watch outs there, because if you're using a substance as a drug, you can't like automatically use it as a food additive. So there's a lot to kind of unpack there in terms of exactly what we're talking about and so forth. But it's a good question. I think I will leave it there.
I think I was just going to say, I think a good way to think about that is if you look at the pharmaceutical excipient business, they can demonstrate their product is safe at their intended use and does not necessarily need pre-approval by the FDA. You still have to have your drug master file that will go to your manufacturer, but you can bring in and start to qualify all sorts of new products. Step over to the food world, this needs pre-approval by the FDA. It needs to be GRAS approved, period.
Exactly. Okay, well, we have a bunch more questions, and I believe these questions will shift over to Slack. So we'll be happy to address them, and I'll turn it back over to the CMS event organizers.